Okay, Don, so here we go. 12.2, Reconstructing Society. So we're going to focus here on kind of the Southern society during Reconstruction, kind of the way whites, blacks, former Confederates, Union Republicans last section, but we're really going to focus in here.
And one thing we really want to keep in mind is the rebuilding of the South, or the reconstructing of the South, is going to be a significantly bigger task than many people today, even back then, assumed. You have to remember this is a Southern society that is completely devoid of any type of political, economic, or social leadership, and is also going to have to deal with the tensions that come from a transition to having millions of former pieces of property now land owning and eventually voting citizens. So we'll talk about what various roles that groups played in reconstructing Southern society.
So, big change in the South is Republican power, right? Remember, starting the Republican Party, it is a sectional party. Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in most southern states in 1860, right? So the Republican Party has a big opportunity in the South. We saw in the election of 1868 where Grant won a lot of southern states as a Republican because of three kind of new kind of Republican men in the South. The first would be a scalawag, right? And these are kind of derogatory terms that Southern Democrats would use to describe these people, but they're the names that historians have kind of stuck with throughout time, right? So a scalawag is a native Southerner that became a Republican after the Civil War, right? And you got to remember, the South voted solidly Democratic pretty much exclusively until the 1970s because Lincoln was a Republican, right? So Southern Democrats had a pretty hard time getting over the Civil War, right? And if you were a Southerner that became a Republican, you were seen as a scoundrel, a scalawag, as a traitor to your class, to your region, to your state.
So, of course, President Johnson being the most famous scalawag, but you saw him in areas like Tennessee and the western part of Virginia, which became West Virginia. Some areas had huge amounts of people that just didn't agree with the idea of secession or the idea of the Civil War, and were in favor of some type of equality for freedmen.
Right. Carpetbaggers are similar to scalawags, where they are Northerners that would move to the South, right? One thing, if you already completed your Southern economic analysis, you could see that land became very cheap in the South. There's a lot of opportunity for business. So a lot of Northerners packed up their bags, and what would be like a carpet bag, a bag made out of carpet, kind of, some actually did, some didn't, but that's the name that stuck. Maybe run a freedman school, maybe open a business, but for whatever reason they moved to the South and voted Republican. They were seen as carpetbaggers, they were outsiders to these kind of white Southerners, and they didn't really appreciate their kind of role in their society.
Yeah, and white Southerners really didn't like carpetbaggers. The reason they gave them the derogatory term is not only because they were outsiders to their society, but they viewed these people as businessmen jumping on a business opportunity. It's sort of like the idea of kicking a man when he's already down. Southerners are so depressed with the state of their Southern society, and then you have Northern Republicans moving in, buying the land up for cheap of a man who fought and died bravely for the Confederacy, and then profiting off of it. So they were seen as sort of like the scum of the earth businessmen who were taking advantage of a business opportunity when Southerners were living through this nightmare and having to experience it.
Yeah, and the final part of the Southern Republican Coalition is the freedmen. Obviously, freed slaves are going to be very supportive of the Republican Party. They were the party that passed the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. They're the party that led the Civil War. Lincoln was a Republican, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Freed slaves had a lot of loyalty to the Republican Party because of the fact that they were the party protecting their rights in the South.
So if we look at Reconstruction in the South, one thing we really have to keep in mind is the devastation of the South. And in order to totally understand Reconstruction, what type of impact it had, and the challenge that lay ahead, is to put in context the nature of Southern society in 1865 at the end of the war. Huge amounts of land and thousands of homes across the South were totally destroyed. Most of the fighting, really all of the fighting, except for Gettysburg and Antietam, happened on Southern soil. Sherman's march to the sea destroyed millions and millions of dollars of property. 20% of the white males in the South were killed in the war. This takes away a huge population of workers and educated men who ran society and ran businesses. And so what we have is we have a confederacy that is literally, in some ways, and figuratively crippled at the end of the Civil War. And more than anything, the South is not only bitter and angry about the physical state of their land and the state of their society. Their economy is totally destroyed. The Confederate was worth nothing. The Confederate States of America's government was ineffective. But more than anything, and the salt in the wound, is that now the North is going to flip their social structure upside down. If Southerners had anything to fall back on, it's at least that Southern society is predicated on one thing primarily, and that is white men and women above black men and women. They are citizens, African Americans are property. And they could always take solace in that, knowing that they were better than someone else. It's the reason why people poke fun and make fun of other people, to make themselves feel better. Well, the problem is now the government is turning these pieces of property into voting citizens. And Southerners become incredulous at the idea that how dare you, a former slave, think you're as good as me? How dare you think that you're equal to me, that you can own a business, that you can own a home on my street, that you can walk on my sidewalk? And those are the types of underlying social tensions that define the Reconstruction struggle more than anything.
I mean, you can see it, especially in poor whites of the time. I mean, that only, like, economically, they probably lived in the exact same conditions as freedmen. They probably were the same, they might have been just as illiterate, right? Probably very limited farm labor, but they had the fact that they were white. That was their pride, that was their whole identity, and everything they had to hold their hat on was held up on the color of their skin. And Reconstruction, especially radical military Reconstruction, really throws that way out of the loop, right? And you're going to start seeing the Southern reaction to these kind of military Reconstruction policies, right? Many Southern states passed black codes, right? These are laws designed to limit the freedom of freedmen. There were vagrancy laws, you couldn't be out. There were curfew laws. There were apprenticeship laws. You had to sign contracts to work with people. So you really try to limit the freedom of African Americans to really do anything. They tried to pass laws to keep them from voting, right? And at the last minute, the last straw would be violence, and especially lynching, right? If an African American had violated some kind of societal norm that the white population had deemed that was respectful, whether it was getting out of the sidewalk or tipping their hat or whatever it was, they could face a very violent death.
And the biggest issue is that today we don't have to worry about those things because the structures in our society allow us to protect our property. If someone assaults us physically, they'll get arrested. They'll face some type of punishment. That's the society we live in which we have inherent trust to a point between the people and the police, although the last calendar year sort of makes that sound stupid as I say it. But the biggest issue here is that wasn't available in the South to many African Americans. They were living in a society in which not only the people they lived amongst, but the very people that were supposed to be protecting them, cops and politicians, were not protecting them. So they were really on their own, and they felt like men and women with no country and men and women with no city, and you could understand why. But immediately, before the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws prevented them from having extensive long-term political success, they did have quite a bit initially. Huron Rebels was the first senator, African-American senator of the United States, and there will be many more in the short term before the Confederacy, the former Confederacy, really clamps down on that.
So the Freedmen's Bureau, there's a lot of work in trying to help African Americans and freed slaves get into the economy, get into freedom, right? lots of black schools, right? You had a huge population of people that were illiterate, that by law weren't allowed to be taught to read and write, right? So it's really, really hard to contribute in a meaningful economic way. You can't run a business if you can't read or write, you can't keep records, you can't write receipts, right? You can't know how much to order or what to order, right? You need these kind of basic skills to be able to function in a middle class or even lower middle class society or do anything beyond manual labor. So education for the free blacks becomes incredibly important. You had grandfathers and their children in school together all learning to read and write at the same time.
Yeah, and what happens here is we don't think about it as important today, but 150 years ago, the idea of land ownership was critically important to being successful. If you could not own land or did not own land, you are inherently going to be limited in what you can achieve and what you can do. And many freedmen gained land temporarily. In states like South Carolina, they took over land from former Confederates. They had gone off to war, died in war, were disenfranchised, whatever. But eventually that land was taken back. When Sherman was marching through Georgia, and then started marching north, he famously told many of the emancipated slaves the government would promise them 40 acres and a mule, but of course they never got that. That's basically because Sherman didn't really like African Americans. He didn't want them fighting with him. So he just promised them land and said the government would take care of them, and went on his way. But what many African Americans realized is that their lives after the war were different than before the war. They were better. And I want to make that very clear before Mr. Manelsky and I start talking about sharecropping. You cannot deny that their lives were better. They were free. That is something you cannot put a price on, and something that is absolutely precious in all walks of life. But their lives still weren't great, because many of them were stuck in a system of sharecropping or tenant farming. And Mr. Manelsky and I put the definition up there just so you can see it, and you can sort of refer back to it if you need to. But we'll sort of explain it to you and try and break it down so you understand exactly what it is.
Yeah, and it ends up in this cycle, right? And it basically starts from the idea that, like, when slaves are freed, they're given nothing but freedom, right? So you can't buy land if you don't have any money. They're not given any money when they're free, so they can't buy their own land. But you have farmers, large plantation owners that had all this land that needed a workforce to farm it, right? But they couldn't sell their land because people didn't have any money to buy it, right? So what they would do is they would give people, normally freed slaves, but also many whites did this too, land, seeds, things to start planting on their property. So the planter is lending money, seeds, land to this farmer. That farmer is to farm and take care of the crop, and when the crop is harvested, they give that planter some predetermined amount of the crop, normally half, sometimes less, sometimes more, right? And that payment is the way that the owner kind of makes his money off the land. But the problem was, a lot of times, the farmer is not making any extra money or even enough money to cover his debts. So the sharecropper is going to keep having to borrow
thinking, well, this doesn't totally make sense. Why would they do it? Why wouldn't they go somewhere else? A few things you have to know, and we really can't stress enough, is these people, like Mr. Manelsky mentioned, had no education, no clothing, nowhere to live, no tools, no seed, no land, no money. And not only that, because they had no education, they didn't know where to go or how to get there. And so if you're, just say something relatable, if you're a former freedman in Virginia, in the middle of nowhere in Virginia, you don't know where to go. You have nowhere to go. There are no options out there for, nobody's looking for a totally uneducated African American who has no idea what to do except farm. And you can't buy land and do it on your own. So you have to go, in many cases, back to the same man that had you in slavery in the first place. Not because it's vagrancy laws saying you can't be wandering around without a job, you legally can't go anywhere. You have to stay on the property. So what would happen is, like Mr. Milski mentioned, you would go to work for a year, but you need to borrow tools, you need to borrow food, you need to borrow clothing, you need to borrow a place to sleep, all of this stuff for a full year. And so the farmer basically gives it all to you, and then when the bill comes due, he says, wait, how much did you make? $100? Oh, yeah, all the stuff you borrowed from me over the past year actually cost $120. So now you owe me money. So now next year I'll take a bigger share of your crop. And then it happened again and again until some sharecroppers literally were working all year and handing all of the crops over to the farm owner. And they couldn't go anywhere because they were in debt to him. So they legally had to stay. So it's basically a way of re-enslaving the African Americans.
And really, you guys, when you do the sharecropping activities, read these contracts. They're incredibly exploitative. They are really designed to keep the farmer like this. I mean, it's their only option, and these owners knew it, and they took advantage of that situation.
Yeah, the freedmen had zero leverage, the farmer had all the leverage, and they knew it. And it was an unfortunate reality that sometimes it took generations for freedmen to get out of. And if we look at, well, how big of a deal was sharecropping? How big of a deal was tenant farming? Which, by the way, is basically the same thing as sharecropping. Ask us in class and we'll sort of explain the differences a bit. But if you look at these areas, these counties in the South, in black, they have over 10,000 slaves or freedmen in that county. So there are huge regions of African American populations in South Carolina, Central Alabama, along the Mississippi River, where the soil is very fertile and farming is better, and in Louisiana, and you can see even in areas of Virginia. So what will happen is these areas will fight more than any other to exploit African Americans.
And really what, the planter class, the white people in the South are worried about is losing their economic place, but also their political power. Like, South Carolina had a majority black population, right? The planter class in South Carolina, they were allowed to freely vote and be enfranchised and have economic freedom. They were seeing their class and their people, their race, being totally losing all power, right? And that's what they're fighting against. They're fighting against that hierarchy being flipped.
So, anyway, anything else, Coach?
I think that's it.
All right, cool. If you have any questions, please be sure to ask your history teacher. Thanks for watching.